Welcome back. We are discussing the lesson how do organisms reproduce. In the previous session we have seen about asexual reproduction. Today we will discuss about sexual reproduction. Let us discuss about the differences between asexual reproduction and sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is a type of reproduction where there are two parents or two individuals involved. In the case of asexual reproduction, there is only single parent. And in sexual reproduction, these individuals they produce gametes, whereas in asexual reproduction, gametes are not formed. Because gametes are produced, one could be a male gamete, another could be a female gamete. These two gametes they need to fuse. This event is called as fertilization, which is absent in asexual reproduction. Of course, asexual reproduction has its own advantages. The main one being only one parent is sufficient to produce an offspring. Not only that, asexual reproduction takes less time and it is very simple method of reproduction. Then why do most of the organisms they prefer a sexual mode of reproduction? This is because of variations. In asexual reproduction, the number of variations seen in the offspring are comparatively less when compared to offsprings produced by sexual reproduction. Why is this so? As you know, in asexual reproduction there is only one parent. Therefore, the offspring receives variations from that parent alone. Whereas in sexual reproduction there are two parents, meaning the offspring receives variations from both the parents. In turn, the number of variations are more. Not only that, organisms that show sexual mode of reproduction, they have a special type of cell division called as meiosis, which you studied in class 9. Why do they have meiosis? This is because if the offspring is receiving DNA from two parents, then what will happen? The offspring will have double the amount of DNA, isn't it? To solve this issue, sexually reproducing organisms, they have specialized tissues present in the body which are seen in the reproductive organs. These tissues undergo meiosis. The result of meiosis is that the tissues produces gametes or germ cells which carry half the number of chromosomes present in the parent. When these two germ cells or gametes fuse, it produces offspring having a complete set of chromosomes similar to the parent. But because the gametes are from two parents, the variations will accumulate in the offspring. Not only that, in the event of meiosis, there is genetic recombination. The DNA duplication event itself produces more variations. Whereas in the case of asexual reproduction, meiosis is absent. Therefore, offsprings produced from sexual mode of reproduction, they have more number of variations. And we know that more number of variations will help an organism to adapt and survive in its environment. These variations are favorable for species and for populations of organisms. That is why even though sexual reproduction is more complex and more time consuming and more energy consuming, they prefer sexual reproduction because sexual reproduction produces more variations. Let us now look at sexual reproduction in plants and animals. In the case of plants, the reproductive part of a plant is its flower. This is in your angiosperms. Gymnosperms do not produce flowers. If you look at the diagram of flower, you see that a flower has a stalk called as pedicel. The stalk will lead into a basal bulged portion called as the thalamus. The thalamus is covered with green colored leaf-like structures called as sepals. These sepals are protective in function. When the flower is in its bud stage, sepals will protect the flower. Then we also see the large colorful petals. These petals, they attract the pollinators towards themselves. In the third whorl, we see the androecium, and in the last whorl, we see the gynecium. The androecium and gynecium are the male and female reproductive part of a flower. The androecium is represented by stamens, whereas the female reproductive part, gynecium, is represented by the pistil. As you can see in the diagram of the flower, the stamen, it consists of a long stalk-like structure called as filament. This filament helps to attach the stamen to either the petals or to the pistil. The upper portion of the stamen is the anther. Inside the anther, pollen grains are produced. These pollen grains, they carry the male gametes. There are two male gametes inside the pollen grain. The female reproductive system is represented by the pistil. The pistil consists of a upper broader portion called as the stigma. This stigma then continues and it becomes narrow into a tube-like structure called as the style. This style then, in the basal portion, it swells. This is the ovary. These three are the components of pistil. The stigma, it serves as a landing platform for the pollen grains. The pollen grains will land on the stigma. The style will help in the transport of the pollen tube. The pollen tube will grow through the style. Inside the ovary, we have the ovule. The ovule has a small opening which is called as the micropyle. It is through this opening the pollen tube enters. Inside the ovule, we have a structure called as the embryo sac. This embryo sac consists of 7 cells. The two nucleus in the center, this is called as the central cell. Opposite to the micropylar end, we have the antipodal cells, which are 3 in number, and close to the micropyle we find the female gamete or the egg cell, which is in the center. This is the female gamete, the egg, and besides the egg there are 2 cells called as the synergids. So inside the ovary we have the ovule inside the ovule we have the female gamete, which is the egg cell. This is the structure of the male and female reproductive parts of a flower. Now, for sexual reproduction to take place, fertilization is important. That is, the two gametes, they have to come in close proximity of each other. The male gamete as well as the female gamete are non-motile, meaning they cannot move on their own. They need to be transferred. Since the egg cell is present deep within the pistil inside the ovule, it cannot be transferred. Therefore, it is the male gamete present inside the pollen grain, inside the anther, which needs to be transferred to the stigma. This event is called as pollination. Pollination can be defined as transfer of pollen grains from the anther to the stigma. Now, if pollen grains are transferred to the stigma of the same flower, it is called as self-pollination. If pollen grains are transferred from the anther of one flower to the stigma of another flower, this flower could be on the same plant or it could be another plant of the same species. This is what is called as cross-pollination. This transfer is helped with the help of wind, water, insects like honeybees, and also birds and some small animals called as pollinators. They will carry the pollen grain from the anther to the stigma. Now, self-pollination is very common in unisexual flowers such as papaya and watermelon. Unisexual flowers contain either the stamen or the pistil in the flower, meaning there is a separate male flower and there is a separate female flower. Whereas in the case of hibiscus, it's an example for bisexual flower, meaning both the male and female reproductive structures are present in the same flower. Example, hibiscus, rose. Self-pollination is very common in unisexual flowers. So once the pollinators like bees or birds have carried the pollen grain to the stigma of the flower, what happens when the pollen grain lands on the stigma? Of course, if the pollen grain is of the same species, then the pistil, the stigma, it will recognize it and it will accept the pollen grain. If it does not belong to the same species, it will reject the pollen grain. Acceptance of the pollen grain will result in germination of pollen grain. The pollen grain will then produce pollen tube. So pollen will undergo germination on the stigma. Then this pollen tube will increase in length and it will grow. This pollen tube, it carries the male gametes, male germ cells. Therefore, the function of pollen tube is transport of male gametes. There are two male gametes or male nuclei. Through the micropyle opening, the pollen tube will enter into the ovule and it will release the two male gametes. So, one male gamete or male nucleus, it will fuse with the egg cell. This will produce what is called as the zygote. This is what is called as fertilization or syngamy. The second male nucleus, the second gamete, it will fuse with the central cell. Inside the central cell, there are two polar nuclei. So the second male nucleus will fuse with the central cell. This will produce the endosperm tissue. This endosperm is a highly nutritive tissue which is required for the development of the zygote. The zygote will use nutrition from the endosperm tissue. This is called as triple fusion because there are 1 plus 2, 3 nuclei involved. Triple fusion. In angiosperms, inside the ovule, inside the embryo sac, there are two simultaneous fertilization events taking place. One is the syngamy, another is the triple fusion. These two fertilization events together will result in what is called as double fertilization. So with that, the male gamete and female gamete have fused and they produce the zygote. The zygote will then undergo repeated divisions to produce a large number of cells, which in the future becomes the embryo. The development of the embryo requires nutrition from the endosperm tissue. During this time, the sepals will fall off, the petals will wither away, even the stamens will fall off because these structures are no longer required. The ovule, which has the growing embryo inside it, the ovule, it becomes the seed which carries the growing embryo within it, and the ovary is now transformed into a fruit. The seed is covered with the fruit. That is the end result of double fertilization in plants. The ovule becomes the seed, the ovary becomes the fruit. Inside the seed, we find the embryo. Embryo consists of an embryonic axis. In a dicot seed, the embryo contains two green leaf-like structures called as cotyledons. In the case of monocots, there is only single cotyledon. Then on the top of the upper portion of the cotyledons, we find the plumule, which in the future will develop into the stem and the leaves, that is the shoot. The lower portion of the cotyledons is known as the radicle. This will develop into the root. Plants have developed different mechanisms for dispersal of seeds. This once again they use animals, water, air for transferring the seeds from one place to another. The seeds have two main advantages for a angiosperm plant. One, because of the variety of dispersal mechanisms, the seeds can move from one place to another. They can land over there and they can grow over there. They can colonize new areas. How is this possible? The nutritive tissues present in the seed will help in the germination and development of the embryo present within it. Therefore, seeds are advantageous for an angiospermic plant. That is about sexual reproduction in plants.